Back from the break, everyone, and thanks again to Peter Fox-Penner and Penny McLean-Connor for our last session. And also just wanted to thank Shauna Ansley back at CS Week. You'll notice in the chat mode section of your dashboard the link for the free book that Peter was talking about, Melting the Ice. You don't want to miss that. Check it out. You can just click there and get it downloaded. So with that, I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Dan O'Shea from ABB. ABB is a pioneering technology leader that works closely with utilities, industry, transportation, and infrastructure customers to write the future of industrial digitization and realize value. Dan is ABB's Director of Utility Strategy and Business Development, EV Infrastructure. Dan, welcome to the EVCx Forum.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here, and I'm very happy that ABB is supporting and sponsoring CS Week. It's an important conference. It's an important topic. To see that CS Week is addressing EVs this year was very exciting to us, so we're happy to do it.
Well, great. Thank you for that, Dan. And just before we get started, we wanted to express our sincere appreciation for for your support. ABB immediately saw the value of this type of industry dialogue that can have in helping to move the electrification of transportation forward. We could not have done this event without both you and ABB support for sure. I do have a few questions here to get started, and and if you're an attendee and if you've got a question for Dan, please just jump in at any time into the question area online, and we'll be sure to time permitting, get to your questions. So as we get started, Dan, just was wondering, could you briefly describe the type of work that ABB does in the EV space with utilities?
Sure thing. Well, as you know, ABB has been around working in the electrification space and the power space for 135 years. As for the deploying of fast chargers, we were one of the first in the space. Actually, about 13 years ago, our first North American utility project was actually with BC Hydro. And that was in about 2012. And to give you an idea of the nature of the business, there were a couple of vendors that were in that program. One of them has since exited the business. It was a very early OCPP integration project as well, and there were lots of lessons learned from that. As far as the evolution of ABB into electrification, it was pretty natural because we've got such a long tradition of providing electrification in propulsion systems in the marine industry. We actually have two ways that we serve the utilities. One's with the charging hardware and connected services, so the products that we make and that we service. And the other is what I focus on, the upstream planning for EV charging deployments. We are able to bring together utility transmission distribution planners with our team of experts to ensure that the capacity is there, the interconnection can happen at the most efficient place. We aim to help the utilities look at EV charging more holistically, not simply as an appliance on the customer side of the meter. So really trying to be there during the planning process and using our power electronics and industry expertise to help.
Great, thank you very much for that background. Now, here's where I find it very interesting. You and ABB have a very interesting perspective, Dan. As an infrastructure provider, you see things on a horizontal plane. You go across utilities as opposed to, and you look across various utilities as opposed to we in the utility business who typically look kind of vertically into our own area and we only know what we know. So as your ability to scan the horizon, not only across North America, but literally around the world, where do you see things that we are doing within in this advantage? Where do you see utilities having success?
I mean, there's a lot of places, and when I think about what utilities are doing, rather than like say success and the opposite of that, which would be failure, but more an iterative learning process as an industry, because it is early days. And even though some of us have been doing this for 10 years, for most of the people in the electric utility industry worldwide, this is still new. Some of these lessons learned are partially outside the scope of the utilities. For example, if you look back a decade, taking advantage of a grant program, which some utilities did, and the vendor apparently does not keep up their part of the bargain, thus leaving some stranded assets. This is a problem that can happen in any industry. It happened in our industry, but I believe experiences like these have led to good things for utilities to push for open standards and interoperability to avoid things like stranded assets. So that was definitely a learned lesson from early days, and I think that is now a universal ask from all utility programs. Early installation of non-network fast chargers led to, site camping by vehicles that would camp out and then get on a train and go to work, and demand charges to an unknowing site host or driver dissatisfaction. This all seems obvious now, but back then it was the lowest upfront cost to purchase a non-network charger, and now that is pretty much the normal ask of any utility program, is to ask for smart charging, because that is seen as a utility asset. I've seen some issues around interoperability. There was a private bus use case from years ago where here's an interoperability issue with CCS. So the bus maker had CCS, we had CCS, both were certified to the protocol. But what we found when we brought the bus was brought to the yard is that there's some wiggle room in the protocol and in the software and the way it's written. It's very specific for the vehicle. It's less specific for the charging company, because the charging company has to work with all the different vehicles. So we learned a lot there years ago, so that interoperability testing, not just from the charger back to the network, but for the vehicles was really very important. I see successes happen when experts are brought on early, and James mentioned something that's also really important: super early stakeholder engagement. That is one of the most important things, and a lesson learned from all the programs that have taken off quickly. I would say they've had early and often stakeholder engagement from all aspects of the community, where the chargers are going to go, the people who may use them, even the people who may not use them. So ratepayer advocates who fear that their rates are going to go up for just a few folks. So there's lots of different things that you need to be aware of, and you're not going to be aware of them unless you get out into the community and do that stakeholder engagement. So those are just a few examples of things that can lead to either a quick launch or a regrouping, shall we say.
So what are the things or steps that these utilities are doing that others not having as much success are having?
One of the things is starting, and this is, for utilities, frankly, outside of California or that don't have mature programs, start small in a controlled manner and work out the kinks. And prior to my time at ABB now, I've been here only 9 months, but in the industry for a decade or so, working on program development where you're starting with a small controlled group of charging stations and a network provider, and importantly, installers, and then customer support inside the utility, and working out the kinks in that value chain, in the handoffs from one to the other, and getting the stations delivered, getting if it's a home program, getting the residents signed up, communicating the program, and then getting the station logged onto the network that you're using. Another element of success is a holistic approach internally at the utility. So as you get into larger programs, engaging distribution and transmission planners, cyber teams, key account management, community outreach, like I've mentioned, customer service, these things are really important. For example, if procurement is not aligned early on, they're going to be looking at some hardware and software that they've never seen before. And so it's going to take a longer time if they're not engaged. You're also going to be dealing with vendors who may never have submitted anything to a utility. And so that might be an ordeal for them to try to get through. So internally having a holistic approach. And another thing that I've found in these stories of the programs that get off to a smoother start is using some standard RFP templates. And this is becoming a best practice, and it's an evolving document, if you will. And I mean, I don't mean that there's one document, but the idea of how it looks and what's in it and what is required and what is nice to have is evolving, because the technology is evolving. You know, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, you weren't asking for 150 to 350 kilowatt chargers you know, and now you are. And so these things are important. So having a standard template, and you can find them at a number of industry associations to look for those. So those are things that I've seen I would call best practices.
Great, thank you. Just a reminder to our audience as well, if you have questions for an expert in EV infrastructure, here's your opportunity to fire away and get Dan's perspective. Next one up that we do have, Dan, is what are the key things that utilities must get right in order to have success with successfully introduced in the electrification of transportation?
Well, progress in this space has a lot to do with what's happening way upstream. And this, now I'm talking about legislatures and commissions. So, you know, in order to compare apples to apples, that has to be taken into consideration. So on a level playing field, you know, you want to make sure that your filings are covering the right hardware, software, the right technologies, the right use cases that you might see. And I think James mentioned earlier about, or someone did, about filing more frequently to keep up with the faster cadence of technology development, and that is definitely one solution. And another one is to literally put in the verbiage that understanding that it's a new industry that moves quickly, that assessments of technologies will happen on a regular basis, call it a yearly basis if you want. But that is important so that you don't get stuck having to do an entire filing or RFP all over again. As a matter of fact, there's a couple of companies back east that have what I would call a rolling admissions program, and several utilities have them. One is happening right now, and it's an update of the technologies that are available. One of the things that is really hard if it's not planned well is finding a site that works for all stakeholders. And someone earlier mentioned how easements and site host agreements are difficult. And so having the lawyers involved and the real estate people involved early is critical, because not finding the right sites can bring your program to a grinding halt, especially if you have a limited number of sites, you know, limited pilot dollars. And even with 100% make-ready funding, a site host still has to spend significant funds to get the charging systems. And so this is something to take into consideration when you're putting a program out there as to who can afford to put it in. And now I'm really speaking about the more expensive fast charge programs. So having the legal documents drawn up and inspections and permitting understood and streamlined from the utility side of things, and understand which parties are taking the risk and doing what you can in the program to mitigate the risk. And utilities are uniquely positioned to take a risk that a private sector can't, as installing in a place where utilization might be low, but eventually will be high. And that's something that is really a good thing to consider. And then putting program elements in place that move the risk to the private sector eventually, but too early, and it can have a dampening effect. So I think that's important to understand.
Great, thank you. What approach would you recommend that utilities take to ensure the successful introduction of transportation electrification?
Well, there's a few things. Having experts on hand, internally or externally, I think this is super important. So either hiring staff, and you know, usually it starts off with one person at a utility that doesn't have a program, or might not be a ZEV state, or the legislature or the commission hasn't acted, so there hasn't really been a reason. And now then, let's say there is a reason. You've got one person who may come from solar or microgrids or storage or energy efficiency. They're going to need some expertise, and luckily there's a lot of places to get it. There's EPRI and IEEE and SEPA and the Alliance for Transportation Electrification that all conduct panels and things like that, and they have documents online. And there's a handful of consultants. There's also your trusted vendors, so someone who you know is going to provide a consultative approach to help you get oriented. And that's what I think is probably the most important, is having expert guidance for all parts of it, the legal, so the filings, the hardware, the software, and then the operational aspects. The other thing that will rear its head if you don't address it early, and I've already mentioned stakeholder engagement, but you must include equity in your programs, and you have to look at the benefits to all ratepayers, and you have to address these issues, and you have to address the what I'll call the ungaraged folks that can never park their car indoors. You have to deal with that. Also, TNC drivers and the communities that they live in, and whether or not they can get access to electrification or not. And these issues have to be addressed up front.
That's great. You know, you've mentioned the flexibility word. We've heard that word throughout these 2 days, and it's something for those just getting into all of this to keep in mind, that it's not just your way or the highway. Everyone's got to be flexible as we progress. Dan, can you comment on industry standards and interoperability issues?
You know, yeah, that's a good question. And just in general, I've already mentioned early on an OCPP integration, and everything else in the utility industry is based on safety standards and interoperability and protocols, you know, international. And you've got, you know, European protocols and North American protocols, but they generally can line up. And this is important if you want systems to get to scale and you want it to interact with the grid. You have to have interoperability, and so you have your hardware to network interoperability, your network to host interoperability, and that's the OCPP kind of integration. Then you've got your frontward facing interoperability, and someone had mentioned roaming before. So OCPI is the main protocol now for having your, you know, EVgo card work at a charge point station or a green lot station or vice versa. And that's super important to have that done. That's, you know, I would say that is not ready for prime time, right? It's not ready for complete scaling. It really needs to be seamless, like bank machines and cell phones. So you used to be, you get a rude awakening if you went out of your service area. I guess I'm showing my age now with the early cell phones, but now you really don't know. You know, the only time you get a notice is if you go to another country. And so having that kind of seamless roaming is going to be important. And then interoperability for talking to the grid, and interoperability for talking to the vehicles. And I mentioned this earlier in the bus case, and it's not just buses, it's cars as well. The CCS and the CHAdeMO protocols are being refined, and there have been times when vehicles have shown up at charging stations and not been able to charge because the two vendors didn't talk to each other. And so doing some more rigorous interoperability testing prior to releasing products is super important. And we're finding also that communications, this is kind of a newer topic, but communications with smart grid and microgrid projects that include EV charging. The EV charging industry and the communication protocols used for demand response and DERMS needs to kind of come together and figure out how that's going to be done.
Thank you. One of our earlier presenters talked about the fact that be sure you've got a really good technology provider along the ride with you. That being the case, what is ABB's approach to charging technology?
Well, we really follow the vehicles, and for specifically for the EV charging. So, we've just come out, or in the last couple of years, with a line of 150 up to 350 kilowatts and 900 volts, because the cars are now coming that can deal with that. We had our workhorse product of 50 kilowatt and then a 50 kilowatt high voltage. We released the high voltage product because the vehicles were able to take it. So we keep a close watch, and we have working relationships with virtually every vehicle manufacturer. So we work with the vehicles, and now also buses and medium and heavy duty trucks. Very important to be working on those. Frankly, we also work in the marine environment. And so we're working on that too for electrification. And interoperability and open standards, as we've already covered, that is critical. And safety standards and things like electromagnetic radiation and EMC and harmonics and things like that are natural for a company like ABB to work on. We're definitely focused on safety in everything that we make.
Thank you. A question in, what is ABB's footprint across North America? Do you serve across North America, or are you geographically focused?
So we are in 100 plus countries, 80 or so just with our fast chargers. We've got about 14,000 units deployed worldwide, over 1,500 deployed in the US and more in Canada. So we really cover the globe. I mean, ABB is a global company, and our EV charging is global as well.
Great. What would you classify as one of ABB's EV success stories?
Oh, well, let's see. There are a lot of them. We're working hard on the NYPA installations in New York, and that is a success story. There's high power dynamic charging with multiple network operators, and we're able to bring that all together with a lot of cooperation from all parties. And I think it's not just a success story for ABB, frankly, it's going to be a success story for the industry, for utilities, for software providers, for installers, and for ABB as well. I think that is a great success story. Doing so much work with companies like EVgo and Electrify America, where we're one of the top providers, and we have an excellent uptime record. Those are all great success stories, and we're very happy and proud to be a part of those large nationwide efforts to get charging out there. So those are just a couple.
Yeah, thank you. Next one. The industry is focused on deployment, but what about the long term? Is there enough operational planning?
So actually, that's a really good question, and I think I'll answer it like in terms of, say, like warranty. It's important to have a warranty. A lot of warranties are parts only. As you get into your fast chargers and your high power stuff, which is where we live most of the time, having understanding the spare parts scenario and the repair and the preventative maintenance scenario for public charging. So these are getting beaten up by the drivers every day, but then you've got your fleets that have 24/7, 365 mission critical needs. So making sure that the funding, this is really critical, that the funding is there for longer term operation, not just in the, hey, we've purchased this thing, we have a 2-year warranty. You really have to look at the life cycle of the site that you're doing. For example, most buses have a 12-year life cycle. So, what is the 12-year plan for the infrastructure for a high utilization fast charge plaza off a highway? What's the use case for that? How often are you going to have to replace a connector or a cable? What are the things that are going to get used and need to be replaced? And that should be considered up front and included in funding proposals from anyone who's looking at doing it.
Thank you. So how do customer service teams fit into an EV charging plan?
They're going to be critical, and James mentioned it. I took a note actually that that utilities are introducing themselves to their customers or reintroducing themselves to customers as a trusted fuel advisor, the provider of safe, reliable, cost-effective fuel for their vehicles. And this is new. And so bringing the customer service teams and leaders into the conversation early, educating them on what's going out there as far as hardware and networking, and deciding where you want to be on the continuum of service. Do you want to be that first phone call? Do you want to provide tier 1 service? And if you do, you have to really get trained up for that. That it's new technology, and it requires training. And the vendors and the software companies have most of them fairly robust support programs, and they're getting better all the time. And so at some point in the installation of chargers, especially at home, you're going to have residents that are going to call the utilities, regardless, even if it says on the hardware, to call the vendor or whatnot. You're still going to get folks calling the utility because it's an electric appliance. And so having the customer service folks trained up on answering those calls and knowing what to do in an expedient manner, being able to help solve these issues is really, really critical. And the other part of training internally is key account managers for commercial industrial. So understanding that those needs and those projects as well, because that is a form of customer service. And it's important that those folks are trained up as well. So I think I'm really happy to see, and this is one of the reasons why we were so excited to sponsor CS Week, is because I think this is the first time that there's been a really concentrated EV portion, and this is it's important because I've seen where it doesn't happen, and I've seen where it does happen, and so I hope that folks take this back and put customer service into the plans if it's not already there.
Well, thank you for that. And so ABB was very, very quick on the draw in terms of recognizing that what we do at CS Week, it is all indeed all about the customer, and to add in the customer element to the whole EV spectrum is something that we believe is going to be ultimately a break point. We heard from a couple, including James, related to just some of the challenges when you go into the showroom, and it's a much longer sales cycle in the showroom. So we have to think beyond the meter, as we've been discussing here.
Well, I just want to make another point about that. So the dealers,
yeah,
that's a whole other form, right? But the utilities can also think about, do they want to train dealers? Do they want to have an integrated program? And Carl Papa may have spoken about this yesterday, and I'm sorry that I missed him, but they are doing a really great job with their program in Austin with the dealers, and I look forward to hearing more about that. But that's really, really important for a utility to consider whether they want to do it or not.
Great, thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so maybe we just turn into rapid fire on these ones. So just some quick ones. So if you were to summarize, Dan, what might you consider to be some of the top challenges for utilities when it comes to EV implementation?
Let's see. Well, dealing with the commissioner education. So this is very far upstream. Making sure that the commissioners get the education that they need to understand their new role in regulating transportation fuel and transportation. This is something that is incredibly important, and that definitely needs to be done. I've already talked about don't ignore community outreach and make sure you embrace equity in your projects. And I've already talked about customer service. I think that definitely needs to be focused on. And hang on, there you go. And I think I've already talked about a lot of the things that need to be focused on, like interoperability. And I think one of the things I haven't is on installation training and whether or not you're using your own people or you're subbing out for installation for high power. So for a level 2, right, it's a clothes dryer. But for high power, it's more complicated. And so having trained, accredited by the vendors, installers is really important. Other things about the programs is I feel like prescriptive technology, you should limit prescriptive technology, all right? It's a new and quickly evolving industry. You know, an example that everyone's probably dealing with or will deal with are credit card readers, right? You don't need to necessarily require a credit card reader, but you do want a payment system. You don't, not this particular payment system, right? And you don't need to be prescriptive sometimes with kilowatt sizes without regard to the use case. So that's really important to understand who's using it, how often, when they're using it. So I know we're kind of almost out of time, so I'll stop there.
Well, that's great. Yes, and we are at time. So just wanted to thank you very much, Dan, again, to both you and to ABB and to Heather and the whole team for standing by us at CS Week as we enter into this very, very important component of the whole EV space. So with that, thank you, and we'll let you go off camera at this point, and appreciate it, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.